Hey YouTubers, been a long time, haven't made any videos. Actually ended up in a kind of a last minute move. So we ended up moving to a different house and I'm in the process of setting up my new workshop. But I had a set of these big valve 862 cylinder heads I was completing and noticed that I didn't really get to show near the work I wanted to or intended to. These, of course, are the small chamber cathedral port cylinder heads, 862 original castings, but they have been opened up to a 215 cc intake port and an 82 cc exhaust port. The valve job was done through Nolan Cylinder Head. That is a CNC multi-angle performance valve job that they offer, which of course is required when you step up to the 2-inch valves in these cylinder heads. Now these will have the stainless steel valves, both intake and exhaust, 2-inch intake, 155 exhaust, should flow well in excess of 275 CFM at the 500 and about 550 lift. Once you get up to 600, it would be more flow, but most camshafts people run are 600 lift or below. So like I've always said, and I think about every instance, heads that flow really big numbers above 600, especially above 625, that's just volume that you don't really need, because most people, I'd say 99.44%, don't run camshafts above 620 lift. So anyway, you want to try to focus your velocity and your port flow in that 550 to 600 lift range, because that's the most common camshaft lift that people use. So let me zoom in a little bit so we can see what we got. All right guys, I had to adjust the lighting a little bit so that you could see the final port texture that I was looking for on the intake port, so it doesn't, what they call, lose suspension of the air fuel mixture as it's coming through the port into the cylinder. But what you'll see is remember I always try to mention or reference landmarks. Leave yourself landmarks so you know how deep you're going. Remove material where the head, remove material that improves your flow. Don't just take material out of the port to make it bigger. But you can see the valve guide reduction, the swirl ramp removal. We've maintained our what I call back wall, or the wall behind the guide. We have maintained as much of or as least of an angle as possible so we can get that air to maintain its velocity, come around the guide and or valve stem and climb that back wall and swirl. It's going to turn and swirl into your cylinder. So, but if you think of the air coming in, you want it to have the least amount of turn as possible, but it's gonna experience a little bit of turbulence and turning or swirl. People want to hear the word swirl. It's gonna come in, try to swirl and come up that back wall and throw that fuel and air mixture into the cylinder. So the biggest thing you need to consider is don't cause anything that's gonna inhibit or promote that fuel falling out of the column of air and being deposited into the port. You got to try to get all of the air and all of the fuel into the port or into the cylinder as efficiently as possible. Now I've had to play with the lighting on this thing because it's really easy to overexpose or overlight. I'll show you. Like you see people that you see their ports and you think, oh my God, they're mirror polished. See, they're just increasing the light. The amount of light that you allow to come into the port greatly affects that perceived port finish. See, if you take away the light, you can kind of see the 60 grit. It's actually close to an 80 grit final texture, I guess. but then you introduce just a little bit of light, and you can see the angles, the ergonometry, the smoothness of the port flow. Then you come up here, see what I'm saying? You can manipulate the amount of light that you put into the port to make your ports look as shiny or as fancy or as pretty as you want to. Because remember, a pretty ports sell, but that doesn't mean they always make power. So let me get to putting these heads together. We'll try to get it on video, and we'll wrap everything up in the end. Basically, you can see where the roof's been raised. The valve guide boss has been greatly reduced. See if we can get some light to bounce in there somehow. But you can look in this left port how the roof was raised, the walls were straightened, the floor was just cleaned up and blended into the new short turn. And then if you kind of look around the guide, you can see where I've greatly reduced the valve guide profile. I'm a firm believer that you can really never have too much exhaust flow. And when you add in nitrous or turbo or some kind of power adder, then the exhaust flow, you're never going to hurt yourself having a high exhaust flow cylinder head. All right, guys, I'll show you a little bit of what I do and how I do it when I'm putting these together. First thing you'll notice, don't laugh at me. First thing, I only put out like 4 valve locks at a time. I don't know why, but I have had the absolute worst luck with knocking valve locks off the workbench in the middle of what I'm doing. Yeah, I about had a nervous breakdown years ago, and that's partially joking, but I was working, I think it was on those, maybe those Quantico cylinder heads, and they had a specific comp cans offset lock, but I somehow had knocked off one of them stupid valve locks while I was assembling the cylinder heads, and I didn't think anything about it. Didn't bother me one bit. In my mind, I was like, oh, it fell right here to my right at my old house. I thought, you know, it's not gonna be a problem trying to find that stupid lock. So I just kept working, putting on what I had, not worrying about it. Lo and behold, I get down to the last valve, and I need that other stupid lock. And I'm like, okay, let's find this lock real quick. I'm not even gonna exaggerate. I literally had to start disassembling my garage one thing at a time. I'm talking about boxes, tools, toolboxes, you name it, searching for this stupid valve lock because it was on a weekend and Star Performance isn't open on the weekends. So I'm panicking. I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to get these stupid heads done because I've lost this stupid lock. But my brain would not give up on finding that stupid lock. Lo and behold, that valve lock, and I have no idea how it got there, had bounced about 4 feet to my right, must have ricocheted off of, oh, I don't know, a box or something, and disappeared in the back of a metal shelf that I had in my shop. Yeah, that's my luck. That's how it usually works. Yeah, so after I literally removed, I would have to assume a third of everything that was in my garage, I found that stupid valve lock on the back of that shelving. And in my mind, I was just like, how in the world? And then I just quit asking. I was like, yep, if it's gonna happen to anybody, it's gonna happen to me right when I'm trying to get something done. But basically, I just use a little bit of petroleum jelly to hold my locks in place. I've just always either used petroleum jelly, or sometimes I'll use just red sticky or tacky grease like you use for bearings. Just something that's sticky enough that it'll hold those valve locks in place, because they can be a pain in the neck. These heads, I don't know if I mentioned it, are getting the pack 12-18 valve springs, so they will be good up to 600 lift. I think if you're going to go over 600, you should probably go to a dual spring. That's just my preference. So if you're wanting to run a little bit stronger spring, go ahead and step up to a dual spring if you're going to go over 600 lift, especially if you're going to run boost. A lot of people don't realize the boost pressure that you introduce to a cylinder, or adversely or on the same line of reasoning, the higher your engine compression, it actually fights against your valve springs. So if you think about like a Top Fuel dragster or something like that, they have enormous amounts of cylinder pressure that's pushing against the valve, which reduces your spring pressure to control the valve at RPM. I don't know, hopefully everybody's following what I'm saying. But what you'll see is on boosted applications, they run a higher spring pressure to counteract the cylinder or boost pressure that's fighting against the valve spring. You don't hear a lot of people talking about that, but it's a real thing. So a lot of times when you see even hydraulic rollers set up specifically for boost, they will actually run 160 pounds of seat pressure and a higher open pressure in an attempt to try to maintain control of the valve at higher RPMs under boost. So hopefully you guys, feel free to research that at your leisure. But I learned that, oh God, years ago from a friend of mine who ran a machine shop. When he was doing a bunch of research and development on the Pro Stock and all those big racers, he was doing some machine work for him, and he was like, I never put that much thought into it. He said, but when like a Top Fuel or even a Pro Mod, he mentioned Pro Mods, anything that's got a real high like boost pressure, 30, 40, 50, 60 pounds of boost, when you see them blow the blower, like they'll say pop the blower, more times than not, that's where they've lost control over the valve at RPM, and it's literally backfired through the intake system and popped the blower off of it. So what they were talking about is not running enough spring pressure, or in many circumstances, because they're running such strong valve springs, they're breaking parts. And as soon as you lose control of that seal on that valve when under boost, especially if you're running any kind of mixture of nitromethane, yeah, that's a recipe for disaster. But I'm just going to go on down the line real quick and throw these springs on there, and then we'll get to something else more interesting. Alright, thought I'd bring you back into Liveville for these last two. Kind of enjoy talking while I'm working, but I gotta stay on track. You know, old people are kind of easy to get lost. So I basically just fold over a shop rag or whatever you want to use just to keep those valves up during the installation process. But you can see how easy it is to assemble these heads as long as you just stay on track. Get your parts all cleaned up, pre-staged, pre-organized. Always helps. I personally prefer to use Felpro positive seals. They have a different material for the exhaust guides and a different material for the intake guides. I just find that they work the best, have the least amount of failures, and they seal really well. A lot of times a lot tighter than some of the cheap ones you see on eBay or the no-name, you know, I call them the no-name branders. But something to remember is when you're assembling these heads, if anything feels weird, off to you, stop and fix it. You know what I mean? That's your chance to save yourself a headache later on down the road. And a lot of times it'll be something simple that you've overlooked or whatever. A lot of people have asked me over the years about my valve spring tool. This is my own design. I designed this and built it. I tried to approach Matt Happel at Sloppy Mechanics to see if he wanted to do a joint venture to mass produce this valve spring tool at a reasonable cost. I mean, in my mind, there's no reason why you couldn't produce these and sell them for, you know, 40 or 50 bucks. The only thing that I need to do is update the design to be compatible with the LS3 style cylinder heads with the offset intake rocker or rocker bolt, which I do have plans for that style as well, because this tool works wonderful on these cathedral port heads, but it doesn't have a hole over where your offset intake rocker would be. And I do have a plan. I can make one just like this. But I had approached Matt and he just ignored my message, so maybe he didn't see it. I don't know. But I was gonna try to use somebody that had more publicity to sell a reasonable price, you know, reasonably priced, because I think all them little stupid pry bar types are just BS. Why would you bother with that when you could build this for very reasonable cost? I don't know. Sometimes things work out, sometimes they don't. But doing 2 valve springs at a time, especially if you're not making a video and you're just focused, you know, just boom, 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 getting a rhythm. After you get these assembled, they want you to take a dead blow or a rubber mallet shocks your locks into being tighter, and that way you know they won't come undone. So, alright, got the cylinder head assembled. Let's move on to something different. Alright guys, I got this thing set up to try to find the final CC on the combustion chamber after just lightly surfacing. Oh, let's run her down to 10. I currently have 60 cc's in the chamber already. So I'm going to see how many it takes to top it off. So, normally these heads start out about 65 cc's. I know that causes a lot of feathers to get ruffled. I've got 60 in there now. And it's above the spark plug hole, but it's not filling the chamber completely. Hold on here. Just a little bitty hairball. Boom, she's full. See. It's a little over 62. I was estimating, because I didn't get an exact figure from Nolan cylinder head. All they said was surfaced enough to true the deck. So they didn't give me the exact amount they cut off the head. All the paperwork said was, you know, remove minimum to make it flat again. So I assumed it would be probably around 63-ish, 64, you know, at the most. And it looks like we are, let's see, I'd say probably about 62, maybe 62 and a half, 62.5 cc. Since we did have a dribble come out whenever I plopped it through the burp hole, I'll just call it 62. After surfacing, which that in itself validates what I've been saying all along, these 862 and 706 heads start out at about 65 cc's. You know, unmilled, unmolested, virgin heads from GM. They're nowhere near the 61.5 cc everybody hoped. But I wanted to get it on video because I forgot to video everything and didn't have time. Go ahead and run around, knock the edge down on all the chambers, because after you surface the cylinder head, you got to go around and remove that sharp edge around the entire perimeter of the combustion chamber to remove that kind of sharp knife edge. So that's where we're at so far.